The landscape of the British Isles has been an inspiration for our greatest artists and writers and composers. I'm traveling in their footsteps to some of the most beautiful places in these islands. In Scotland and Ireland, we'll explore the mountain glens, backdrop to Scotland's violent history. Lochs shrouded in mist, encircled by forests. Green pastures and craggy peaks. Places of mystery and legend. A coastline of deserted beaches. And on, up into the Highlands. It's only in the last 300 years that landscapes like this have been really appreciated for their natural beauty. And during those 300 years, Ireland and Scotland have had a very troubled relationship with England. But artists, writers, composers have used this landscape to create a sense of national identity for their two countries and to impose that image on the rest of the world. My journey begins in Edinburgh, one of the world's most handsome cities, set in a landscape of hills and crags. For my money, this is the finest view of Edinburgh from Carlton Hill. You see it in its natural setting. You see the old town huddled around the castle, the new town down here. It was here in 1825 that a painter called Alexander Naismith came, and he saw all the new building going on here, his city being transformed. And he painted a vision of the Edinburgh of the future, and indeed the Scotland of the future, Edinburgh from Carlton Hill. This is a celebration of progress. The Union of England and Scotland in 1707 had unleashed a new energy in the Scottish capital. Fine buildings were springing up. The city was booming. The dynamic new town dominates the painting. This is a vision of a country that's forward-looking and modern. But at the same time, a different vision of Scotland was being forged, romantic and nostalgic. In 1822, George IV became the first reigning monarch to visit Scotland since Union. And when he arrived here in Edinburgh, he was greeted by the most extraordinary sight. These streets were lined with Highlanders, all dressed in tartan, wielding axes and pistols and swords and playing the bagpipes. And for the 15 days that he was here, these streets were transformed into a Highland fantasy. The painter Sir David Wilkie captured the king's visit for posterity. But it was a writer who'd stage managed this gathering of the Highland clans, the popular author Sir Walter Scott. Scott believed in the union with England, but he knew that it was a troubled marriage. Many of his fellow countrymen suspected an English takeover would destroy their culture, and the English always feared a Scottish rebellion. Walter Scott's masterstroke was to kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, he was saying to the Scots, don't worry, your identity is safe, intact. But on the other hand, you've got to accept this man as your reigning monarch. Or as he put it, we are the clan, he's the chief. George IV loved it. He even agreed to appear in public wearing a rather short kilt and flesh-coloured tights, I suppose so the public couldn't see his knobbly knees. Sir Walter Scott's masterpiece of street theatre astonished many Scots, most of whom had no connection with the Highlands. But thanks to Scott, they've been saddled with the image of the Highlander ever since. And the new Scottish style would become all the rage. Clan chieftains queued up to be painted in full Highland dress. How many tartans are there now? How many different patterns?
There's between 3,000 to 4,000 different tartans.
But you can't
You can have your own tartan if you want.
I can. You can make a Dimbleby
We can
tartan.
design one for you, yes. That will be
A unique Dimbleby tartan.
That would not be a problem.
How would you do that?
We would design it. You would tell us probably what kind of colours you would like, and we could design it for you at a fair price, of course.
But if I wore a Dimbleby tartan in the streets of Edinburgh, I'd be hung, drawn and quartered.
Not at all. Not
It
at all.
would be. They'd say,
Not at all.
what's he doing dressed up like a Scotsman?
Anybody can wear a tartan nowadays.
3, 2, 1. All right.
I'm leaving the city, driving north into the Trossachs, a Gaelic word which means bristly country. These dense forests are the gateway to the Highlands. These are the legendary bonny banks of Loch Lomond, stretching 23 miles north to south, the longest stretch of fresh water in the British Isles, and of course immortalised in the famous song, written by a Highlander awaiting execution who's speculating on what's going to happen to his spirit and comparing it to a fellow prisoner who doesn't face execution. Oh, ye'll take the high road and I'll take the low, and I'll be in Scotland afore ye, but me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny banks of Loch Lomond. I had a Scottish music teacher and I think she'll be turning in her grave. From the moment Walter Scott first came here as a 15-year-old, he fell in love with the Highlands. The landscape would inspire some of his most popular novels like Waverley and Rob Roy. In Rob Roy, Walter Scott described Loch Lomond as one of the most surprising, beautiful and sublime spectacles in nature. But it wasn't just the extreme beauty of this magical spot that appealed to him, it was also its history. He wrote, "Every valley has its battle, and every stream its song." It was as though for him the very rocks contained the history of Scotland. Sir Walter Scott was a publishing sensation. He set up his own printing business, and his novels and poems about the Highlands were bestsellers all over the world. Travellers had always avoided this place, believing it to be wild and dangerous. Now, they wanted to see it for themselves. Sir Walter Scott called this the land of the mountain and the flood, and visitors flocked here to see the places that he had so vividly described, clutching copies of his books, keen to follow in the steps of Rob Roy. What Walter Scott had done was to jumpstart the Scottish tourist industry. Hello, how do you do?
You look lovely when you're standing out. You look smaller.
You look smaller in real life.
Yeah, you do.
Are you one of the Dimbleby boys?
I am.
Yeah, yes.
How do you do? David, I am. Hello. How do you do? Tell me what you like about it up here.
Oh, it's the scenery, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really, really fresh. It's lovely, the countryside and the views.
It's so nice and fresh up here, fresh, lovely and fresh air.
How do you find the people?
Oh, they're fine.
Not bad.
Fine, yes. Yeah. Can't understand a lot of what they say, mind, but apart from that,
Sir Walter Scott was rather alarmed by the arrival of his dedicated fans up here. He wrote exasperatedly that every London citizen makes Loch Lomond his washpot and throws his shoe over Ben Nevis. But it wasn't the least of his problems. In 1825, there was a stock market crash, and Scott's printing business went bust. He promised to pay off all the debts, £120,000, that's about £5 million by today's money. And so for the rest of his life, everything he wrote was used to pay off his creditors. He died penniless in 1832. Sir Walter Scott had ignited a love affair with the Highlands. Artists from the industrial lowlands followed him, looking for inspiration. One of them emerged as one of Scotland's greatest painters, Horatio McCulloch. He embraced the new passion for this part of Scotland, calling one of his paintings, "My Heart's in the Highlands." And a piece of music written by a young composer from Glasgow captured the romance of this landscape. His name was Hamish MacCunn. Born in 1868, MacCunn was a child prodigy. He was composing by the age of 5, and he wrote this piece when he was just 19. The overture brought Hamish McCunn instant success and lasting fame. When it was first performed in London in 1885, the playwright and music critic George Bernard Shaw said of it, "It was a charming Scotch overture that carries you over the hill and far away." And Hamish was soon being acclaimed as Scotland's national composer. Thank you very much. The best thing about travelling in Scotland is kippers for breakfast. I have them every morning and rate them 0 to 5. I think this is sort of heading towards 4. Delicious. And of course, bread and marmalade go with it. Indispensable. I'm driving through the northeastern Highlands, some of the wildest and most unspoilt landscape in the country. A young artist came here in 1842 and started a love affair that would last a lifetime. Her name was Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria made hundreds of sketches and watercolours of the landscape. This was the young Queen's escape. She wrote in her diary, "All seemed to breathe freedom and peace, and to make one forget the world and its sad turmoils." In 1848, Victoria built a castle at Balmoral in Scottish baronial style, complete with turrets. When Victoria was up here, she adopted what she thought of as the proper Scottish lifestyle. She had Scots oats for breakfast. She had pipers going round the dining room. She got Prince Albert to design a special Balmoral tartan. The Balmoral tartan for the curtains, Balmoral tartan for the chairs, Balmoral tartan for the carpets. And it said that when she was up here, she spoke with a Scottish accent. Can't believe that fooled anyone. Victoria's presence at Balmoral made the Highlands fashionable. Wealthy tourists came to enjoy the pleasures of the Scottish countryside. Deer stalking inspired one of the most romantic visions of Scotland, the most famous painting to come out of the Highlands. Proud and defiant, the noble stag dominates the landscape. Sir Edwin Landseer was Queen Victoria's favourite artist. Landseer was a regular man about town. He was a wit, a mimic, a bit of a dandy. When his fellow artist, the landscape painter John Constable, saw him at an official dinner, he said that the frills on his shirt stretched from his chin down to his navel, and that his hair was a mass of a beautiful 1,000 curls. Landseer became very quickly the richest artist working in Britain, and all by fulfilling a particular kind of Victorian taste. Landseer began drawing animals when he was 4 years old. He soon realized that a wealthy man would pay more for a portrait of his dog than of his wife. And so he cornered the market in animal portraits. This is Queen Victoria's favourite dog. And Landseer often joined in royal hunting parties at Balmoral.
When he was in the Highlands, Landseer was an avid stalker. Who does not glory in the death of a fine stag, he said. There's something about all the toil and trouble, the wild weather, the savage scenery, that makes butchers of us all. The only thing is, he was rather a poor shot, and he couldn't decide whether to shoot or draw the stag. To the consternation of his fellow stalkers, sometimes once he got a stag in his sights, he'd hand them the gun and take out his sketchbook. Peter, you're a professional at this business of stalking. What is it that you have to do?
Well, first of all, you're dealing with a very intelligent animal. He's got first-class eyesight, great sense of smell, and good hearing. So to outwit him, you must be that one little bit smarter than he is.
What's the secret of a successful stalk?
The main idea is to keep out of sight of that deer for as long as possible, and especially up above. If you break the skyline, they'll twig you right away. So it's essential you stay out of sight for as long as possible.
And do you walk or crawl all the time?
We walk till we come in view with them, but we do try to walk as close as we can. And then when we can go no further, then we have to go and crawl.
It's not something you could do if you had hay fever, is it?
Oh, I know. It'd be great difficulty, I would think.
Sneeze at the last moment.
I'm heading across to the western edge of the Highlands, on my way to one of the most haunting places in Scotland, Glencoe. For 500 years, this was home to the MacDonald clan. But in 1692, they were the victims of one of the most violent acts in Scottish history. Fearing an uprising, the English government had decided to make an example of them. They sent to Glencoe members of the Campbell clan, known for their loyalty to the English. The MacDonalds welcomed them into their homes and entertained them for 10 days.
On the 12th of February, the Campbells received orders that the following morning at 5 o'clock, they were to slaughter every MacDonald under the age of 70. It was to be secret and sudden. A beacon was lit on this hill as a signal for the massacre to start. And in a blinding snowstorm, they set off after their hosts, still many of them slumbering in their beds, and started killing them, killing in all 38. It was an act of treachery, a betrayal of everything that the clan system was meant to stand for. It's quite appropriate. The Glencoe in Gaelic means Valley of Weeping.
Nearly 200 years later, the artist James Hamilton painted distraught MacDonald survivors. But Horatio McCulloch had a different vision. In his picture, the landscape stands as a memorial to that terrible day. A storm has just passed, and the dark clouds are rolling away across the sky. The only sign of life is a small herd of deer, standing in the shadows, dwarfed by the mountains above. The emptiness of the glen is a reminder that this is a scene of tragedy and lost lives.
You're a MacDonald,
I'm a MacDonald, yes.
so you can imagine the massacre taking place in this scenery.
Yes, I can imagine it, yes. It's not hard to imagine what happened. It's quite a frightening place at times. It's supposed to be haunted. You do hear sounds that you can't explain.
Is there still bad feeling between MacDonald and Campbell?
The Highlander isn't like that. He doesn't carry a grudge. That's the way we are. We can forgive. We don't forget them.
When the first English tourists started coming here, they were pleasantly surprised to find that there were good roads in Scotland because the English army had had them built. Of course, nowadays we're rather more impatient, and although, as the crow flies, the distances in Scotland are not all that great, the roads, of course, have to go round the mountains and round the lochs, so travelling takes a good deal more time. But the nice thing is, there are always treats along the way, and here's one of them. Oh, hello.
Hello.
Can I have some oysters?
Certainly.
Delicious, thank you very much. You know, I had Lochfine oysters when the thing first began. How many years ago was that?
Well, the company
20 years
started
ago,
25 years
Yeah,
ago.
that's right.
Yes,
They're meant to be very good for all sorts of things, oysters, aren't they?
they are, yes.
What kinds of things are they meant to be good for?
Well, they say they're an aphrodisiac.
Really?
Yes.
How many do you eat in a day?
Oh, I don't eat very many.
Delicious. Lovely.
Do you like another one?
Please. Yes. We'd better pay you.
I'm driving into Kintyre, a long peninsula on the west coast of Scotland. Kintyre is another Gaelic word. It means Land's End. The history of Kintyre was shaped by a great injustice the Highlanders suffered in the 19th century.
Landowners realised that they could make good money out of sheep farming on a large scale, or from leasing their estates for fishing or shooting or stalking. And as a result, they decided to drive the Highlanders off their land. It was called the clearances. It lasted 50 years, and the effects were devastating. Tens of thousands of families were driven out of their homes. Some of them went down to the coast and tried to make a living from fishing. Others left Scotland altogether, emigrating to England or Ireland or to America.
Artists immortalised the Highland clearances. An elderly clansman, too frail to travel, is left at the quayside as his family prepares to leave the country. In another picture, a couple sail for their new life abroad. In 1895, an artist called William McTaggart, born in Kintyre, painted his own response to the clearances. It's a sombre seascape, showing a boat sailing away from the Scottish coast, carrying its human cargo of homeless Highlanders forced off their land. William McTaggart made a living for himself as a painter from the age of 16, painting portraits in Edinburgh. But he was always drawn to this landscape.
McTaggart would come back to Kintyre every summer to paint, and he painted in oils on canvas, and quite large canvases, which he'd set up here on Machrihanish Beach. He'd either prop them up against the rocks or use ropes and stones, or even have his son heroically holding the canvas against the wind while he painted away on the beach like this. It was unheard of to paint in the open air on this scale at that time, and particularly under these unpredictable Scottish skies.
Born into a Gaelic-speaking, crofting family, McTaggart understood how hard it was to make a living here in Kintyre. In his painting The Storm, a rescue ship is launched to save a fishing boat that's being swept towards the rocks. A crowd looks on, sheltering from the elements. McTaggart paints the people as tiny, vulnerable figures at the mercy of the storm.
McTaggart's work is far removed from the Highland idyll of Landseer or McCulloch. He once said, "It's not grand scenery that makes a fine landscape. Humanity's the thing." A few miles south of Machrihanish, where McTaggart did most of his work, is the Mull of Kintyre, the southernmost point of the peninsula, and the nearest that Scotland gets to Ireland, only 12 miles away across the sea. So close that on a clear day you can almost reach out and touch it. Both Scotland and Ireland responded to England's attempt to create this United Kingdom by, in their own ways, focusing on their sense of national identity and national pride. In Scotland, it took the form of a flowering of Scottish culture. And the same thing happened in Ireland, except that there it nurtured a struggle for independence, which led to bloodshed.
The peaceful landscape of Ireland masks a history of turbulence. The revival of Irish art and culture and politics had its roots here in the landscape of County Sligo in the west of Ireland. In the 1870s, this place was an inspiration to a boy who came here on holiday each summer with his family. His name was William Butler Yeats, and he grew up to be Ireland's national poet.
Yeats was to become a passionate nationalist, and it was his childhood here in Sligo that instilled in him a love of his home country.
He wrote that when he was living in London, he was so in love with the fields and roads of Sligo that he longed for earth from a road, that he might kiss it. Yeats was a romantic. He dreamt of living here, the island of Innisfree, in the middle of Lough Gill. Yeats was entranced by this place. As a boy, he spent a night on the shore of the loch to see the island at sunrise, and he always kept the memory of it in his heart. Many years later, he was walking down Fleet Street in London when he saw a fountain, and it reminded him of Innisfree, and he went back home and wrote perhaps one of his most famous poems, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, and a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. I never thought I'd ever see this place. I learnt the poem when I was a child, and I remember being very puzzled by the 9 bean rows and the hive for the honeybee, but the lines that really caught my attention was, and I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and the evening full of linnets' wings. I thought that was beautiful, and it touched me somehow, I don't know, in the sort of turbulent times of one's youth. It restored a kind of calm. In 1889, when he was 23, Yeats met and fell in love with a stunningly beautiful actress with large, luminous eyes called Maud Gonne. She became the love of his life. She embodied everything that he loved about Ireland. He said that her beauty was like something that came out of pictures or poetry, and her stature was so great she seemed to belong to a divine race. Maud Gonne was a founding member of Sinn Féin. Eager to impress her, Yeats joined the secret Irish Republican Brotherhood, an organisation planning to use violence to overthrow British rule. On the 24th of April, Easter Monday 1916, the revolutionaries rose against the British in Dublin, a turning point in Irish history. Within 5 days, the uprising was crushed. 450 people died, 2,500 were injured. The ringleaders were executed, becoming martyrs to the Irish cause. Yeats was moved to write one of his most impassioned poems, Easter 1916, which ends with the line, "All changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born." After the Easter Rising, the struggle for independence intensified. Yeats' dream of a free Ireland seemed to be becoming true, even as his passion for Maud Gonne was thwarted. Maud never returned Yeats's love, but he remained besotted by her all his life. Many years later, she was asked whether she didn't feel any guilt at this rejection, and she replied coolly, "If I had returned his feelings, the world would have been deprived of his beautiful poetry." At the start of the 20th century, W.B. Yeats issued a call to Irish artists to come back to Ireland and make it the subject of their work. And one person who did this was Paul Henry. He had actually been brought up a Protestant in the north, in a rather claustrophobic religious atmosphere, and he'd gone to Paris to paint, to escape it. And then he chose to come back here. It was a decisive moment in his career.
In August 1910, Henry arrived with his wife Grace here in Achill, a barren, windswept island just off the west coast of Ireland. He used this landscape to change the way we see Ireland.
The Henrys came here for a fortnight's holiday, but the moment they arrived, Paul said that Achill was like a homecoming. It spoke to him as no place before ever had. And within 3 days, he was up here on the rocks looking out over the sea, and he took out his return ticket to London. He tore it into little bits, and he scattered it into the sea. They stayed 9 years.
You both live here, and he obviously saw something in this place. What would you think it was that he saw in the place?
The scenery and the beaches and the mountains and all that certainly appeals to me. I tried living in a city for a while, and I must say I was glad to get back here.
My first time coming back to Achill, when I first started courting, if you like, my present wife, my only wife, I came over the hill from Bonacurry. And to me, like Paul Henry, it was like coming home again. And I haven't left the place since, and I wouldn't wish to leave it.
What's its secret?
There's a magic about it. There's even a winter magic on those wild, woolly days. And once you get to know the place, you wouldn't ask to live anywhere else.
Henry's paintings of Achill promoted a new vision of the Irish landscape, one of land, sea and sky captured in soft light and subtle colours.
Henry painted all over the island, but this was his favourite spot. He often came down here at dawn, and you can see why. It's a completely entrancing spot. These great rocky hills, but gentle colours, green and grey on them. The sea constantly changing, the waves rolling in up the beach. But above all, I think it's the sky, the clouds coming in from the Atlantic, which play strange tricks on the landscape. Sometimes a headland is lit up. The next moment, cloud comes down and you can't see it. Now it's there, now it's gone, a kind of magic. It's no wonder that he thought Achill represented the very soul of Ireland.
In 1922, most of Ireland, with the exception of the 6 northern counties, won independence from Britain. These are the Glens of Antrim in Northern Ireland. It was here that an artist called James Humbert Craig painted his own response to the Irish landscape. Craig stayed in the village of Cushenden. His paintings captured daily life
in the newly created Northern Ireland. He was also inspired by the rolling hills and the bold, ever-changing skies of County Antrim. Like many of his fellow artists from the north, Craig continued travelling all over Ireland, ignoring the new line that divided the country in two. Wherever he went, north or south, he painted the landscape.
In the 30 years since W.B. Yeats's challenge to Irish artists to come home, a new artistic vision of Ireland had been born. But at the same time, the struggle for independence from Britain had split the country in two. In the 1920s and 30s, though, Irish artists celebrated one country, a picture of an Ireland without borders.
Across the sea from Ireland is a small, uninhabited rocky outcrop of the Scottish Hebrides. This is Fingal's Cave, a spectacular natural formation of black basalt columns created by a subterranean explosion 60 million years ago.
It is astonishing to see this site, these massive little cubes of rock at the bottom, the great upright verticals of the pillars, and then above it what looks like an enormous sort of bouffant hairstyle of rock, all whirling around on top.
In the late 18th century, Fingal's Cave became a fashionable beauty spot.
Fingal's Cave wasn't just popular because it was such a spectacular natural phenomenon, it was also part of Gaelic mythology. It was said that the 3rd century Irish hero, Finn, who was a giant, and after whom Fingal's Cave is named, built a pathway from Ireland to Scotland, which came ashore here.
One of the cave's most famous visitors was the German composer Felix Mendelssohn. In August 1829, when he was 20, he set out by paddle steamer to Fingal's Cave.
Mendelssohn was violently seasick, but he was so impressed by this great Atlantic swell rolling into Fingal's Cave that the first bars of the overture, the first tune, actually came to him, he said later, while he was inside the cave. He went back from here to Mull. He managed to persuade somebody to let him play a piano, even though it was a Sunday and piano playing was strictly forbidden, and there and then wrote down the first bars.
Two years after Mendelssohn's visit, the painter William Turner also made the pilgrimage to Fingal's Cave. This is the painting, inspired by that experience, a blur of shapes and colour. It captures something of the wildness of the sea, the remoteness of the island. To the right-hand side is the paddle steamer that took him to the entrance of the cave. Turner's painting was sold to an American, Colonel James Lennox, for £500. And when Lennox got it, he looked at it and said, it's indistinct. Indistinctness, said Turner, is my forte. Just 5 miles south of Fingal's Cave is the tiny island of Iona. St. Columba landed here from Ireland in the 6th century, bringing Christianity with him. Iona is a timeless place. With only 100 inhabitants, it feels cut off from the world. In 1912, a painter called Francis Cadell arrived here from Edinburgh, importing a modern, exuberant style. And it wasn't just his painting that raised eyebrows. His appearance also caused a stir. Cadell, or Bunty as he was called, was a larger-than-life character. He was physically big, round. One of his friends said he was like a marrow. And he was boisterous, talkative, witty, flamboyant. When he came here, he used to wear a kilt, coloured waistcoat, silk shirt. And the islanders seeing him go past would say, "Ah, here's himself." Cadell scoured the island for views that captured its moods. Clouds blow in quickly from the Atlantic, altering the colours of the sand and the sea and the sky. Cadell loved the changing light and used bright colours and rough brushwork to capture what he saw before it disappeared. Cadell used to paint very fast, quick, impressionist brushstrokes. He was once out here painting the Abbey when an artist who'd been here for several days, painstakingly do his painting, said to him, "You can't have finished yet." And Cadell said, "Oh, yes, I have. It took me a couple of hours, and I've sold it for 100 guineas. Cadell may have painted in a modern style, but his work continued a tradition of landscape painting that went back 100 years, a celebration of Scotland, romantic, rugged, and proud. No journey through Scotland would be complete without a visit to the home of a writer who awakened the pride of Scotland. Over 200 years ago, in his famous song, "My Heart's in the Highlands," he wrote, "Wherever I wander, wherever I rove, the hills of the Highlands forever I love." He was, of course, Robbie Burns, the national poet of Scotland. Burns was born in the lowlands of Ayrshire, in the southwest of Scotland. The eldest of 7 children, he grew up in poverty in a struggling farming family. What influence do you think being impoverished, in effect, and working hard on the farm had on Burns' outlook on the world and the poetry he wrote?
I think it definitely influenced him in a lot of his poetry that he wrote much later in life. His poetic genius was just budding when he was here. I mean, he wrote his first poem to Nellie Kilpatrick, who was tying the corn to him in the field. And she was his first love because he described how he felt the blood racing through, pulsing through him when he was taking the thistles out of her hands. Her hands was full of thistles after her binding the corn, and he wrote the poem Handsome Nell. That's his first poem.
A gaudy dress and gentle air may slightly touch the heart, but it's innocence and modesty that polishes the dart. 'Tis this in Nelly pleases me, 'tis this enchants my soul, for absolutely in my breast she reigns without control.
It's a deceptively beautiful landscape looking out across the sea towards the Isle of Arran. But it must have been hell to work this land, particularly in Burns's day. Thick mud, a hard living, but it gave him the inspiration for some of his finest poetry and for his deep-seated belief in the importance of the ordinary Scottish man and woman. In one of his later poems, A Man's a Man for All That, he wrote a passionate declaration in favour of the common man. The honest man, though aye so poor, is king o' men for all that.
When Burns' first volume of poetry was published in 1786, he was celebrated as the ploughman poet. He set off on a tour of the Highlands, where he gathered together old songs in the Scottish dialect. Burns knew they were on the verge of extinction. Sometimes only a few half-remembered lines remained. But he was determined to save them, and he refused to accept payment for his work.
Robbie Burns died in poverty at the age of only 37, but in his short life he'd done more than anyone to revive Scottish culture. Among the many songs he collected was one that became My Heart is in the Highlands, a love song to the Scottish landscape. The first part's old, he said, the second part is mine. And what he'd done was to find an old Gaelic song and then adapt it, rewrite it, and give it back to the people of Scotland.
My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the Highlands, a-chasing the deer, a-chasing the wild deer and following the roe. My heart's in the Highlands, wherever I go.